Welcome to HFY Chronicles. At the sum of 1,000 subscribers, I'll post a special series just for you. Subscribe now. The vast chamber of the Galactic Advisory Committee fell silent as the last echoes of ancient Zoltar's pronouncement faded into the cavernous ceiling. Beings from 1,000 worlds held their breath, those that breathed anyway, waiting for Secretary Nylema to respond. Her azure tendrils quivered slightly, the only indication of her growing concern about the situation that threatened the very fabric of galactic harmony. The Terrans were coming, and no one was prepared. Nylema dipped her tendrils gracefully as she swiped a delicate tentacle across the holographic screen hovering before her. The display shimmered with a soft blue glow, illuminating her iridescent skin in the dimly lit chamber. Representatives from across the galaxy watched, with varying degrees of interest and apprehension, their diverse physiologies creating a living tapestry of evolutionary marvels. "So that is dealt with," Nylema announced, her melodious voice carrying effortlessly through the chamber's perfect acoustics. "What is next on the agenda, Ancient Zoltar?" The Ancient Zoltar of Furakan, forebeing of the Advisory Committee on Non-Member Species, slowly chewed his cud as he glanced down at the synth sheet before him. His massive form shifted, causing his ceremonial robes to rustle like autumn leaves in a gentle breeze. 4 of his 6 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep contemplation among his kind. The weight of 12 millennia of wisdom seemed to press down upon his broad shoulders as he considered his response. "Terrans," Zoltar rumbled, his voice like distant thunder across a desert plain. "Terrans are spreading too fast, too wide. We must find a way to slow their growth so our cultures can prepare and adapt to their presence." The committee chamber erupted in a cacophony of concerned murmurs. The Terrans, humans as they called themselves, had only achieved faster-than-light travel 3 decades ago, yet already they had established colonies in 17 systems and trade agreements with 22 non-Terran species. Their adaptability was unprecedented, their curiosity insatiable, and their diplomatic corps surprisingly effective despite their species' youth. Representative Mox of the Galgarian Collective tapped her crystalline appendages against the table, creating a series of musical notes that translated roughly to impatience. "We've discussed this for 3 cycles already. The Terrans pose no military threat. Their technology remains primitive by our standards. It is not their weapons that concern us," countered Ambassador Droon, his gelatinous form pulsating with each syllable. "It is their ideas. Their concepts of individual rights and democratic governance are spreading among the younger generations of several member worlds. The hegemony of Plex has reported widespread protests demanding elections and representation." Ancient Zoltar nodded gravely. "Precisely. Cultural contamination proceeds at an alarming rate. We must act before irreversible changes occur." "Why don't we turn their natural inquisitiveness against them?" a fuzzy, disembodied voice suggested from the far end of the table. The speaker seemed to fade in and out of focus, existing partially in this dimension and partially elsewhere, a characteristic of the enigmatic quantum collective. This particular member called itself Vexot, though no one was certain if this was a name, title, or description. "Let us give them an unanswerable question and claim it is vitally important that they aid us in finding the answer," Vexot continued, its form shimmering like heat waves above desert sand. "Their entire species will become obsessed with solving it. Their expansion will halt while their finest minds wrestle with our cosmic riddle." The chamber fell silent as all eyes, sensory appendages and perception organs turned toward Ancient Zoltar. He chewed thoughtfully, his lower jaw moving in slow, deliberate circles as he considered the proposal. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic breathing of Lumara of Tordan, who was hibernating quietly in her chair, as she had been for the past 17 meetings. Finally, Zoltar dipped his massive horns in agreement, the golden rings adorning them catching the light. "Excellent idea, Member Vexot, but what pointless question shall we ask the Terrans?" The various members of the committee fell into deep thought. Representative Mox's crystalline body refracted light in complex patterns as she processed possibilities. Ambassador Droon separated into 3 smaller entities to consider multiple approaches simultaneously. The delegation from the methane-breathing Havorians expelled thoughtful bubbles that popped with soft, musical notes. "Perhaps we could ask them to calculate the exact number of stars in the galaxy," suggested Councillor Plexus, his exoskeleton clicking as he shifted position. Too simple, countered Ambassador Droon, now reconstituted into a single entity. Their quantum computers could provide a reasonable estimate within decades. What about the meaning of existence? Offered Representative Mox. Too philosophical, Vexot replied, momentarily solidifying before becoming fuzzy again. Many of their religions and philosophical traditions already claim to have answers to that question. They would simply refer to existing texts. Gentle beings, I have an idea, Secretary Nylema interjected quietly, her tendrils curling with subtle excitement. All attention turned to her as she continued. A question so vague and grand it will occupy them virtually forever. A question that no philosopher has ever answered, and will never until the heat death of the universe. The chamber grew still with anticipation as Nylema's tendrils danced across her console, pulling up ancient texts and obscure philosophical treatises from across the galaxy. We shall ask them, she said with growing confidence, what is the ultimate question of life, the universe and everything, but we shall frame it as though we already know there is an answer, a numerical answer, and that we desperately need their help to find it. Ancient Zoltar's eyes widened in appreciation. Brilliant, Nylema. They will spend generations searching for a question that matches an answer that doesn't exist. Very well, Nylema, Zoltar said as he unfolded his massive form from his bench, towering over the assembled representatives. See to it, will you? Draft the formal request to the Terran Alliance. Make it seem urgent but not threatening. Appeal to their desire to be seen as equals among the galactic community. Nylema bowed her upper body in acknowledgement, her tendrils forming the traditional gesture of acceptance. It shall be done, Ancient One. As the committee adjourned, none of them noticed that Lumara of Tordan had opened one eye briefly before returning to her hibernation. A slight smile played across her reptilian features before disappearing. 3 standard cycles later, approximately 7 Earth months, the Galactic Advisory Committee reconvened. The chamber was abuzz with anticipation as members took their places around the grand table. Secretary Nylema appeared uncharacteristically nervous, her tendrils twisting around each other in what her species recognized as extreme discomfort. Ancient Zoltar rapped a hoof on the floor, the sound reverberating through the chamber like a ceremonial drum. The conversation ceased immediately. "Shall we begin?" Zoltar intoned. "There is but one item on the agenda. I see the Terrans are still busy expanding. Did they refuse the question?" "They must have," Vexel said, momentarily becoming almost completely solid in agitation. "The question is unanswerable as well as meaningless, but it should take the Terrans ages to realize that." All eyes, echolocators, and organic radars swung towards Secretary Nylema, except those belonging to Lumara of Tordan, who was still quietly hibernating in her chair, though the slight upward curve of her mouth might have suggested she was not entirely unconscious. No, Nylema said quickly, her voice higher than usual. "It turns out that the Terrans already knew the answer to the question." The ancient Zoltar rumbled loudly, his massive form rising partially from his seat. "What?" "Impossible!" exclaimed Ambassador Droon, separating into 5 distinct entities in his shock. Nylema waited until the committee members had calmed somewhat, though the chamber still buzzed with disbelief and confusion. "We asked a lot of Terrans," Nylema explained quickly, her tendrils moving in soothing patterns designed to calm the assembly, "and they all agreed on the answer, some of them quite violently so." "I refuse to believe that," Vexort said hotly, fully materializing for the first time in recorded history, revealing a form that resembled a geometric impossibility. "The Terrans don't even agree on their own nutritional requirements or the preferable temperature range for their species." Nylema shrugged with all her tendrils, a gesture she had adopted from the Terrans themselves. "Nevertheless," she said softly, "they were quite insistent that they worked it out before they were FTL capable." "Preposterous," Zoltar rumbled so loudly that the table vibrated, causing Representative Mox to emit a series of alarmed chimes. "Pure Terran madness and megalomania." Nylema shrugged again, her tendrils moving in a complex pattern that conveyed both resignation and amusement. "Apparently the answer is 42, and before anyone suggests it," Nylema added, noting several members preparing to speak, "the Terran government has officially and with some force stated that it is not a Terran priority to find the question." The chamber erupted into chaos. Ambassador Droon split into so many entities that they began to overflow his designated space. Representative Mox vibrated at a frequency that shattered her water glass. Councillor Plex's exoskeleton turned a bright purple, a sign of extreme confusion in his species. Only Ancient Zoltar remained relatively composed, though his cud chewing had accelerated to an alarming rate.
"Explain," he demanded of Nylema. "How could they possibly have anticipated our question?"
Have they developed telepathic abilities? Are they monitoring our communication? Nylema's tendrils twisted in what might have been embarrassment. Neither, Ancient One. It appears that over 2 centuries ago, a Terran entertainment creator named Douglas Adams wrote a series of fictional accounts called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In this story, an enormous computational device was built to calculate the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. After 7.5 million years, it produced the answer, 42. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. "Are you suggesting," Zoltar said slowly, "that a Terran predicted our exact question 2 centuries before their species even achieved spaceflight?" "It appears so," Nylema confirmed. "When our diplomatic envoys presented the question, the Terrans initially thought we were making a cultural reference to this story. When they realized we were serious, their reaction varied between amusement and concern for our mental well-being." Vexot, still fully materialized, floated slightly above his chair. "This cannot be coincidence. Perhaps this Adams was in contact with time travelers or interdimensional beings." "Or perhaps," came a voice that startled everyone present, "you underestimate the Terrans." All heads turned to see Lumara of Tauradan, fully awake for the first time in decades. Her scales shimmered with iridescent patterns as she stretched her ancient limbs. "I have been monitoring the Terrans since they first split the atom," Lumara continued, her voice carrying the weight of millennia. "They are a species of paradoxes, capable of both tremendous cruelty and boundless compassion, simultaneously brilliant and foolish. They create art that captures the essence of existence, while also designing weapons that could end it." She rose to her full height, towering even over Zoltar. "And they have a gift we lack. Humor in the face of cosmic insignificance. This Adams did not need interdimensional help to conceive of our question. He simply understood the fundamental absurdity of seeking simple answers to complex questions." The committee sat in stunned silence as Lumara continued. "I suggest we abandon this approach. The Terrans will not be distracted by philosophical puzzles. If anything, they thrive on them. Instead, I propose we simply invite them to join the committee as junior members. Their perspective may prove refreshing." Ancient Zoltar considered this for a long moment, his cud chewing slowing to a thoughtful pace. Finally, he dipped his horns in agreement. "So be it. Secretary Nylema, please draft an invitation to the Terran Alliance, and perhaps include a copy of this Hitchhiker's Guide in our official archives. It seems we have much to learn from our new colleagues." As the meeting adjourned, Nylema noticed Lumara approaching her. The ancient reptilian bent down to whisper, "Don't worry about the confusion you've caused today. In the grand scheme of things, it's mostly harmless." Nylema's tendrils curled in surprise as she realized Lumara had made a joke, a Terran joke. Perhaps there was hope for galactic harmony after all. In the days following the committee meeting, the Galactic Advisory Chamber buzzed with unprecedented activity. Representatives from all corners of known space gathered in small clusters, their conversations animated and often heated. The revelation about the Terrans had sent shockwaves through the galactic diplomatic community. Secretary Nylema found herself at the center of this storm, her communication channels flooded with inquiries, concerns, and no small number of conspiracy theories. "I still maintain this is evidence of temporal interference," insisted Vexot, who had taken to remaining fully materialized, a development that continued to startle colleagues who had never before seen the quantum being's complete form. "The statistical probability of a pre-FTF species accurately predicting our exact question is infinitesimal." Nylema's tendrils formed a pattern that her species used to indicate polite disagreement. "With respect, Member Vexot, you're applying quantum collective probability models to a species that defies conventional analysis. The Terrans have a remarkable capacity for imaginative leaps." Ambassador Droon, who had finally managed to reintegrate into a single entity after the shock of the previous meeting, oozed closer to join their conversation. "Have you reviewed the complete works of this Douglas Adams, as Ancient Zoltar requested?" I have, Nylima confirmed, bringing up a holographic display of her findings. It's fascinating. The Terran in question wasn't attempting to solve any cosmic riddle. He was creating entertainment, what Terrans call comedy. The absurdity was intentional. Comedy? Droon's surface rippled with confusion. They find existential questions amusing? In a way, Nylima explained, her tendrils dancing as she accessed more files. Terran humor often involves confronting the uncomfortable or the unknowable through the lens of absurdity. It appears to be a psychological coping mechanism. Vexiti's geometric form shifted slightly, approximating what might have been a thoughtful pose. Perhaps we should study this comedy concept more thoroughly. It might provide insights into Terran decision-making processes. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of ancient Zoltar, his massive form parting the crowd of representatives like a stellar destroyer through an asteroid field. The chamber quieted immediately. Secretary Nylima, Zoltar rumbled. The invitation has been sent to the Terran Alliance as directed. Their response was unexpected. Nylima's tendrils stiffened with concern. Unexpected how, Ancient One? They accepted immediately, Zoltar said, his multiple eyes blinking in sequence. No negotiations, no demands for concessions or special treatment. They simply expressed gratitude for the invitation and asked when they should arrive. The gathered representatives exchanged glances of surprise and suspicion. In the complex dance of galactic diplomacy, immediate acceptance without negotiation was virtually unheard of. That's unusual, Ambassador Droon admitted, his form rippling with unease. Indeed, Zoltar agreed. Furthermore, they're sending only 3 representatives, not the customary delegation of 12 that new member species typically provide. Nylima's console chimed with an incoming transmission. Ancient One. I'm receiving the details of the Terran delegation now. Her tendrils moved rapidly across the holographic interface. Their representatives will be Dr. Eleanor Patel, xenobiologist, Ambassador Jamal Washington, diplomat, and, this is odd, Professor Miguel Reyes, described as a cultural interpreter and humorist. A humorist? Vexot's form flickered with what might have been indignation. They're sending a professional comedian to the Galactic Advisory Committee? It appears so, Nylima confirmed, her tendrils curling with what her colleagues recognized as curiosity rather than offense. The Terran message explains that Professor Reyes specializes in cross-cultural communication through humor and is the galaxy's foremost human expert on the works of Douglas Adams. The ancient Zoltar was silent for a long moment, his cud-chewing slowed to a contemplative pace. Finally, he spoke. Perhaps this is not as strange as it seems. If humor is integral to Terran communication and problem-solving, sending a specialist makes diplomatic sense. When will they arrive? Asked Representative Mox, her crystalline form refracting light in patterns that suggested cautious optimism. 3 standard cycles from now, Nylima replied. They've requested permission to arrive in their own vessel rather than using our transportation network. Granted, Zoltar decided immediately, and let us prepare appropriate accommodations. We must ensure they understand we take their membership seriously, despite our previous approach. As the committee members dispersed to make preparations, Lumara of Tordan approached Nylima, moving with the fluid grace that belied her ancient age. You seem troubled, Secretary, she observed. Nylima's tendrils twisted in a pattern of conflicted emotions. I am concerned, Elder Lumara. The committee initially sought to delay Terran integration into galactic society, yet now we're accelerating it. Are we making another mistake? Lumara's scaled lips curved into a subtle smile. Perhaps you're asking the wrong question, young one. Instead of wondering whether we're making a mistake, consider this. What might we learn from a species that faces the incomprehensible vastness of the universe and responds with laughter? Nylima considered this, her tendrils slowly relaxing into a pattern of thoughtful acceptance. You've been awake and watching them for longer than anyone realized, haven't you? Let's just say, Lumara replied with a twinkle in her reptilian eyes, that I've always appreciated a good joke. 3 standard cycles passed with remarkable speed as the Galactic Advisory Committee prepared for their new members. The Great Chamber had been modified to accommodate Terran physiological needs. Oxygen content adjusted, temperature regulated, and gravity calibrated to Earth standard. A section of the chamber had been redesigned with appropriate seating and communication interfaces. On the appointed day, representatives from across the galaxy gathered in the observation dome to witness the arrival of the Terran vessel. The sleek ship that emerged from hyperspace was smaller than expected, its design emphasizing elegance over intimidation. Its hull bore the insignia of the Terran Alliance, a stylized image of Earth surrounded by stars, with the words Per aspera ad astra inscribed beneath. Through hardships to the stars, Nylema translated for the benefit of those present. A fitting motto for a species that has faced so many challenges in their brief history. The Terran ship docked with perfect precision, and a delegation led by ancient Zoltar proceeded to the arrival chamber to greet their new colleagues. The airlock cycled, and 3 humans emerged. Dr. Eleanor Patel stepped forward first, a woman of average height with deep brown skin and silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical style. Her eyes, sharp and observant, took in the assembled aliens with professional interest rather than awe. Behind her came Ambassador Jamal Washington, tall and dignified in formal diplomatic attire that combined traditional Terran elements with subtle nods to galactic fashion. His posture conveyed confidence without arrogance. Last emerged Professor Miguel Reyes, whose appearance contradicted many expectations. Rather than the flamboyant figure many had anticipated, he was a slight man with kind eyes and an unassuming presence. Only the subtle quirk at the corner of his mouth hinted at his profession. Ancient Zoltar stepped forward, performing the traditional greeting gesture of his species, a deep bow that caused his ceremonial horn rings to chime softly. On behalf of the Galactic Advisory Committee, I welcome you representatives of Terra. Your presence honors us. Ambassador Washington responded with a perfect replication of Zoltar's gesture, the movement so precise that several committee members exchanged impressed glances. The honor is ours, Ancient Zoltar. The Terran Alliance is grateful for this opportunity to join the galactic community as contributing members. The formal introductions continued as each committee member greeted the Terrans according to their cultural protocols. Throughout the ceremony, Secretary Nylema observed the humans carefully. Dr. Patel's eyes constantly moved, cataloging species and behaviors with scientific precision. Ambassador Washington maintained perfect diplomatic composure, but it was Professor Reyes who intrigued her most. He said little, but his eyes missed nothing. An occasional subtle smile suggested he was finding gentle amusement in the proceedings, without any hint of mockery. When the formalities concluded, the delegation moved to the Great Chamber for the official induction ceremony. As they walked, Nylema found herself beside Professor Reyes. "I hope our accommodations are suitable, Professor," she said, her tendrils forming a pattern of polite inquiry. "Perfectly so, Secretary Nylema," Reyes replied with a warm smile. "And may I say, your command of English is remarkable." "Thank you." Nylema's skin flushed a deeper blue with pleasure at the compliment. "I've been studying Terran languages since your species achieved radio communication. Your linguistic diversity is fascinating." "As is your tentacle language," Reyes observed. "I notice your appendages communicate independently of your spoken words. A parallel conversation, perhaps?" Nylema's tendrils froze momentarily in surprise. Few non-cephalopods had ever noticed the subtle language of her tendrils. "You're very observant, Professor." "A prerequisite for good comedy," he replied with a wink. "Understanding what remains unsaid is often more important than hearing what is spoken aloud." They entered the great chamber, where the full committee awaited. The Terrans were escorted to their designated area, and Ancient Zoltar took his position at the head of the assembly. "Today marks a historic occasion," Zoltar began, his voice resonating through the chamber. "For the first time in 12 millennia, we welcome a new species to full junior membership in the Galactic Advisory Committee. The Terrans have demonstrated remarkable adaptability, curiosity, and resilience, qualities that will enrich our collective wisdom." The formal ceremony proceeded with the reading of rights and responsibilities, the presentation of credentials, and the symbolic exchange of cultural artifacts. Throughout it all, Nylema noticed Professor Reyes watching with that same subtle smile, as though privy to a gentle joke that harmed no one but brought him quiet joy. When the ceremony concluded, Ancient Zoltar addressed the Terran representatives directly. "As is our tradition, we invite our new members to address the committee. Please share with us your hopes for this new partnership." Ambassador Washington spoke first, delivering a diplomatically perfect speech about cooperation and mutual growth. Dr. Patel followed with an eloquent appeal for scientific collaboration across species boundaries. Then it was Professor Reyes's turn. He stepped forward, and the chamber fell silent with anticipation. "Distinguished representatives of the galaxy," he began, his voice warm and conversational rather than formal, "I stand before you as someone who has spent his life studying how different cultures find common ground through shared laughter. Some might wonder why the Terran Alliance would send a humorist to such an august body." He paused, looking around the chamber with a gentle smile. "The answer is simple. Because the universe is absurd, and we Terrans have learnt that acknowledging this absurdity is the first step toward wisdom." A murmur ran through the assembly as translation devices conveyed his words. "Consider our first indirect contact with this committee," Reyes continued. "You asked us the ultimate question of life, the universe and everything, the very question a Terran author imagined centuries ago. Some might call this coincidence. Others might suspect cosmic interference." His eyes twinkled as he glanced toward Vexot, "But I prefer a different explanation, that across the vast differences of biology, culture, and history, we share a fundamental understanding that existence itself poses questions too grand for simple answers." The chamber had grown completely still, every being focused on his words. "The joke in Douglas Adams's story wasn't that the answer was 42, Reyes explained. The joke was that after millions of years of calculation, the answer was meaningless without understanding the question. And that, distinguished representatives, is why I'm here. Because Terrans believe that acknowledging the limits of our understanding is not a weakness, but a strength. We don't claim to have all the answers, we're just excited to join you in asking better questions." For a moment, silence reigned in the chamber. Then, unexpectedly, Lumara of Tordan began to laugh. A rich, rumbling sound that seemed to resonate from the depths of her ancient being. One by one, other representatives joined in, each according to their species' expression of amusement. Ambassador Droon rippled with colorful patterns, Representative Mox chimed melodically, and even Ancient Zoltar's shoulders shook with quiet mirth. Secretary Nylema found her own tendrils dancing in the pattern of joyful appreciation as she realized what had happened. Professor Reyes had accomplished something unprecedented. He had united the diverse beings of the Galactic Advisory Committee in shared laughter. As the sounds of alien amusement filled the chamber, Nylema caught Lumara's eye. The ancient reptilian winked at her, and in that moment, Nylema understood. Perhaps the committee's mistake in trying to distract the Terrans had been no mistake at all, but the first step toward a more harmonious galaxy, one where even the most serious questions could be approached with humor and humility. Ancient Zoltar raised his hooves for silence, his eyes bright with newfound respect. "Professor Reyes, on behalf of the committee, I thank you for this perspective. I believe I speak for many when I say we look forward to asking better questions together." As the formal session concluded and representatives began to mingle more casually with the Terran delegation, Nylema approached Professor Reyes once more. "That was quite remarkable, Professor," she said, her tendrils forming patterns of sincere admiration. "You've accomplished in one speech what our diplomatic corps has attempted for centuries, creating genuine connection across species boundaries." Reyes smiled warmly. "The secret, Secretary Nylema, is understanding that beneath our differences, we all share the same fundamental experience, trying to make sense of a universe that defies simple explanation." "And is that why humor is so important to Terrans?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Precisely," he nodded. "When faced with the vast incomprehensibility of existence, we have two choices, despair or laughter. We found laughter to be far more productive." Nylema's tendrils formed a pattern of thoughtful consideration. "Perhaps that is what we've been missing in our approach to galactic governance. The ability to laugh at our own limitations." "It's not too late to learn," Reyes suggested gently. "In fact, I believe that's why I'm here." Across the chamber, Ancient Zoltar was engaged in animated conversation with Dr. Patel, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by genuine curiosity. Ambassador Washington had somehow convinced Vexar to try a Terran beverage, resulting in the quantum being's form shifting through a rainbow of colors as it processed the new sensation. Lumara of Tordan approached Nylema and Professor Reyes, her ancient eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "It seems your species will fit in quite well here, Professor," she observed. "We're certainly going to try," Reyes replied with a respectful nod. "Though I must admit, we were somewhat surprised by the invitation after the unusual first contact approach." Lumara's scaled lips curved into what was unmistakably a smirk. Sometimes, Secretary Nylima, she said, ignoring Reyes's comment and addressing her colleague directly, the most important diplomatic tool is knowing when to admit a miscalculation and change course accordingly. As Lumara moved away to join another conversation, Nylima's tendrils twisted in sudden realization. She knew, she whispered. All along, she knew exactly what would happen. Professor Reyes chuckled softly. I suspected as much. Your colleague has the look of someone who appreciates a good long-term joke. But that would mean Nylima's tendrils twisted in complex patterns as she processed the implications. That this entire sequence of events, from the question to our invitation, might have been orchestrated to teach the committee a lesson about Terran nature? Reyes finished for her, his eyes twinkling. As we say on Earth, Secretary Nylima, sometimes the universe has a sense of humor all its own. As the reception continued around them, Nylima found herself laughing, a sound she rarely made in official settings. Perhaps the Terrans had more to teach them than anyone had anticipated. And perhaps, just perhaps, the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything wasn't meant to be answered, but to be shared among friends across the stars, united in the joyful absurdity of existence. In the observation dome above the great chamber, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the concerns of the beings below. But for the first time in many millennia, representatives from across the galaxy were learning to look at those stars not with solemn reverence or calculating ambition, but with the wide-eyed wonder and gentle humor of their newest members. And in that simple shift of perspective lay the promise of a new era in galactic relations, one where even the most serious questions could begin with a smile. As the formal reception transitioned into a more relaxed gathering, the great chamber's atmospheric controls adjusted to create an environment comfortable for all species present. Soft bioluminescent lighting pulsed gently along the walls, mimicking the natural rhythm of the ancient Furican forests where ancient Zoltar species had evolved. The subtle touch wasn't lost on Ambassador Washington, who made a point of complimenting the design to Counselor Plex. Your attention to environmental psychology is impressive, Washington observed. Creating a space that subconsciously puts multiple species at ease requires remarkable sensitivity. Counselor Plex's exoskeleton shifted to a pleased lavender hue. We've had millennia to perfect the art of interspecies comfort, Ambassador, though I must admit, accommodating Terran sensibilities presented unique challenges. Your species seems to simultaneously crave both novelty and familiarity. An accurate assessment, Washington acknowledged with a smile. We're contradictory by nature. It keeps life interesting. Across the chamber, Dr. Eleanor Patel had drawn a crowd of scientifically minded representatives. Her holographic display showed a three-dimensional model of Earth's biosphere, highlighting the remarkable biodiversity of the Terran homeworld. Over 8 million species, by our latest estimates, she explained to the fascinated audience, and we've only catalogued about 20% of them. New discoveries occur daily. Extraordinary, breathed Representative Mox, her crystalline form vibrating with excitement. Such diversity on a single world. No wonder your species developed such adaptive cognitive patterns. Dr. Patel nodded. We evolved as pattern recognition specialists in an environment that constantly presented new challenges. It shaped not just our problem-solving abilities but our entire approach to existence. Including your humor? Asked a representative from the methane-breathing Hevorians, their translator rendering their bubbling speech into standard galactic common. Especially our humor, Dr. Patel confirmed. Humor often arises from recognizing unexpected patterns or connections, seeing how things that seem unrelated actually connect in surprising ways. Meanwhile, Secretary Nylima found herself engaged in increasingly fascinating conversation with Professor Reyes. They had moved to a quieter corner of the chamber, where a small garden of xenobotanical specimens provided both privacy and a pleasant sensory environment. I'm still processing the implications of what you said earlier, Nida May admitted, her tendrils forming patterns of intellectual curiosity. The idea that acknowledging the limits of understanding could be a strength rather than a weakness challenges many of our foundational diplomatic principles. Reyes nodded thoughtfully. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? But consider this. When we pretend to know more than we do, we close ourselves off from new information. We become defensive of our supposed knowledge rather than receptive to discovery. Like the committee's approach to Terran expansion, Nylin realized, her tendrils momentarily forming a pattern of embarrassment. We assumed we understood your species based on limited data, then acted on those assumptions, rather than seeking to learn more.
Exactly, Reyes said gently. But don't be too hard on yourselves. It's a universal tendency. Humans are just as guilty of it, perhaps more so, given our shorter lifespans and the resulting pressure to reach conclusions quickly. Neelima's tendrils shifted to a pattern of thoughtful consideration. How do Terrans overcome this tendency? How do you maintain humility about the limits of your knowledge? Humor helps, Reyes replied with a smile. It's difficult to take yourself too seriously when you're laughing. But beyond that, we've developed cultural and institutional practices that encourage questioning assumptions. Science, at its best, is built on the principle that all knowledge is provisional, subject to revision when new evidence emerges. Fascinating, Neelima murmured. In many ways, that contradicts the committee's traditional approach to governance, which emphasizes stability and consensus over adaptation. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of ancient Zoltar, who moved with surprising grace for his massive form. I hope I'm not intruding, he rumbled politely. Not at all, Ancient One, Neelima assured him, her tendrils forming a pattern of respectful welcome. Professor Reyes, Zoltar began, his multiple eyes focusing intently on the human. Your speech has prompted considerable discussion among the senior members of the committee. We find ourselves re-evaluating certain assumptions about governance and knowledge. Reyes inclined his head respectfully. I'm honored that my words have sparked reflection, Ancient Zoltar. That's the highest compliment a communicator can receive. Indeed, Zoltar continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential register. I must confess, Professor, that our initial approach to your species, the question we posed, was not entirely in good faith. It was an attempt to distract your people from expansion while we prepared for more substantive engagement? Neelima's tendrils froze in shock at this unprecedented admission from the normally reserved Ancient One, but Reyes merely smiled gently. We suspected as much, he acknowledged, though perhaps not immediately. It was Ambassador Washington who first recognized the pattern. Similar diplomatic tactics have been used throughout human history. Zoltar's eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of surprise, yet you accepted our invitation without hesitation or recrimination. Of course, Reyes nodded. Why hold a grudge over what was ultimately a rather elegant diplomatic maneuver? Besides, the incident gave us valuable insight into committee dynamics. And what insight did you gain? Zoltar asked, genuine curiosity evident in his rumbling voice. That beneath your advanced technology and millennia of diplomatic experience, you're not so different from us, Reyes replied with a warm smile. You face uncertainty with the tools available to you. Sometimes those tools include misdirection or strategic delay. We understand because we've done the same throughout our history. Zoltar was silent for a moment, his cud chewing slowed to a thoughtful pace. Your perspective is refreshing, Professor. Most species would have taken offense at such tactics. Life's too short for unnecessary offense, Reyes said with a shrug. At least, human life is. I understand some of your committee members measure their lifespans in millennia, which presents its own challenges, Zoltar acknowledged. When one lives for thousands of years, the temptation to avoid change becomes nearly irresistible. Perhaps that is why Lumara found your species so intriguing. Your brief lives necessitate a different relationship with change and uncertainty. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Lumara of Tordan approached their small group, her scaled form moving with fluid grace. I couldn't help overhearing my name, she said, her ancient eyes twinkling with amusement. Are you revealing all our secrets to our new colleagues, Ancient Zoltar? Merely acknowledging what they have already deduced, Zoltar replied with what might have been a touch of defensiveness. Professor Reyes was just explaining the Terran perspective on our initial diplomatic approach. Ah yes, Lumara's scaled lips curved into a smile. The question. A rather roundabout way of saying hello, wasn't it? But then, the committee has always preferred the scenic route to direct engagement. Neelima noticed that Lumara seemed more animated than she had been in centuries, her usual reserved demeanor replaced by an almost playful energy. The ancient reptilian turned her gaze to Professor Reyes. I've been studying your species since before you harnessed electricity, Professor, she revealed. I've watched your people survive catastrophes that would have ended less adaptable species. I've seen you create art of breathtaking beauty, even while facing existential threats. But what fascinated me most
was your capacity for finding humor in the darkest circumstances. It's a survival mechanism, Reyes acknowledged. When reality becomes too overwhelming to process directly, humor provides a side door into understanding. Precisely, Lumara nodded, her eyes gleaming with approval. Which is why I suggested to certain committee members over several decades that perhaps the best way to understand Terrans was to engage with them through a question that would reveal their relationship with cosmic uncertainty. Nalima's tendrils twisted in sudden comprehension. You orchestrated the entire scenario, she realized aloud. The question wasn't meant to delay Terran expansion at all. It was a test of how they would respond to philosophical absurdity. Lumara's scales shimmered with what might have been the reptilian equivalent of a blush. Let's say I nudged the committee in a direction I believed would be illuminating. The results exceeded even my expectations. Ancient Zoltar's eyes widened as he processed this revelation. You've been awake and observing far more than you let on, Elder Lumara. Hibernation can be tedious after a few millennia, Lumara admitted with a dismissive wave of her clawed hand. I found the emerging Terran civilization far more interesting than committee procedural debates. Professor Reyes laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to lighten the atmosphere around them. So while we thought we were responding to a galactic test, you were conducting an experiment of your own. I believe on Earth we call that a meta-joke, humor operating on multiple levels simultaneously. An apt description, Lumara agreed, her ancient eyes twinkling. Though I assure you, my intentions were serious beneath the methodological humor. I believed, and still believe, that Terran perspective is precisely what this committee needs after 12 millennia of increasingly calcified thinking. Ancient Zoltar might have looked offended had his species' facial structure allowed for such an expression. Instead, his multiple eyes blinked in rapid sequence, a sign of processing new and potentially uncomfortable information. Are you suggesting, Elder Lumara, that you manipulated committee policy to force an acceleration of Terran integration into galactic society? He asked, his rumbling voice carefully neutral. Manipulated is such a harsh word, Ancient Zoltar, Lumara replied smoothly. I merely created circumstances where the committee could recognize for themselves the value of Terran inclusion. The decision to invite them was yours, made freely after witnessing their response to the question. Nalima watched this exchange with growing fascination, her tendrils unconsciously forming patterns that reflected her mixed emotions: surprise at Lumara's revelation, admiration for her foresight, and a touch of concern about the implications for committee protocol. Professor Reyes, however, seemed delighted by this turn of events. I must say, Elder Lumara, your approach to interspecies diplomacy would be right at home among human strategists. Creating situations where others can discover for themselves what you already know is a cornerstone of effective teaching on Earth. Teaching, Lumara repeated thoughtfully. Yes. That's a more comfortable framing than manipulation, isn't it? I've been teaching, not manipulating. Ancient Zoltar's cud chewing had accelerated to a pace that suggested significant agitation. Regardless of how we frame it, Elder Lumara, your actions represent a significant departure from committee protocol. Decisions about species integration are meant to be made collectively based on objective criteria. And they were, Lumara countered calmly. I merely ensured that the committee had the opportunity to observe Terran response to philosophical absurdity, a quality not measured by our standard integration metrics, but one I believe to be essential for evaluating their potential contribution to galactic society.
The tension between the two ancient beings was palpable, creating a gravity well of awkwardness that threatened to pull in everyone nearby. Secretary Nylima found her tendrils twisting anxiously, uncertain how to navigate this unexpected diplomatic complication.
It was Professor Reyes who diffused the situation with the same gentle humor that had characterized his earlier address. If I might offer a Terran perspective, he said, his voice warm and conciliatory, both approaches have merit. Structured protocols provide necessary stability, while occasional creative disruption prevents stagnation. Perhaps the ideal lies not in choosing between them, but in recognizing when each serves the greater good. Ancient Zoltar and Elder Lumara both turned to regard the human, their ancient dispute momentarily forgotten. In this case, Reyes continued, it seems the outcome has benefited all parties. The committee has gained new perspectives, the Terran Alliance has gained valuable allies, and the galaxy as a whole has gained a more diverse approach to governance. Does the unorthodox path that led here diminish these benefits? Zoltar was silent for a long moment, his cud-chewing slowing to a thoughtful pace. Finally, he dipped his massive horns in a gesture of concession. Your wisdom belies your species' youth, Professor Reyes. Perhaps this is why Elder Lumara saw such potential in Terran integration. I have always appreciated those who can see beyond process to purpose, Lumara acknowledged, her scaled features softening. Forgive an ancient being her methods, Zoltar. After 12 millennia of committee service, one develops creative approaches to institutional change. The tension dissipated as quickly as it had formed, replaced by a sense of mutual understanding that transcended species differences. Neelima marveled at how deftly Professor Ray had navigated the conflict, finding common ground where moments before there had seemed only opposition. As the reception continued around them, the four beings, representing vastly different evolutionary paths, lifespans, and perspectives, found themselves engaged in increasingly meaningful conversation. Ancient Zoltar shared insights from millennia of governance that fascinated Professor Reyes. Elder Lumara described her observations of pre-spaceflight Earth that left Neelima's tendrils dancing with curiosity. Cultural barriers dissolved in the face of genuine intellectual exchange.
Across the chamber, similar connections were forming. Dr. Patel had moved from discussing Earth's biodiversity to a passionate exchange about evolutionary convergence with representatives from 6 different worlds. Ambassador Washington was engaged in what appeared to be a friendly debate about governance models with Ambassador Droon, whose gelatinous form was displaying colors that indicated intellectual stimulation rather than diplomatic caution.
As the gathering began to wind down, ancient Zoltar called for attention. The chamber quieted as all eyes, sensory appendages, and perception organs turned toward him. Today marks not just the addition of a new species to our committee, he began, his rumbling voice carrying effortlessly through the space, but perhaps the beginning of a new approach to galactic governance. The Terrans have reminded us that wisdom can be found in unexpected places, even in questions that seem to have no answers. He turned to face the Terran delegation directly. On behalf of the Galactic Advisory Committee, I extend not just welcome but gratitude. Your perspective has already enriched our discourse in ways we could not have anticipated. Ambassador Washington stepped forward to respond, but to everyone's surprise he deferred to Professor Reyes with a subtle nod. The humorist moved to stand beside ancient Zoltar, his unassuming presence somehow commanding attention without demanding it. Thank you, ancient Zoltar, Reyes began, his voice warm and sincere. On behalf of humanity, we are honored to join this august body. We come not as conquerors or competitors, but as students, eager to learn and colleagues hoping to contribute. He paused, looking around the chamber with a gentle smile. There's a concept in Terran philosophy called beginner's mind, approaching each situation with openness and without preconceptions, even when you have experience. It allows for discovery where expertise might see only the familiar. As the newest members of this committee, we offer our beginner's mind as our first contribution. His eyes twinkled as he continued, and perhaps, if you'll permit us, we'll occasionally remind you all not to take the universe or yourselves too seriously. After all, any cosmos that produces such magnificent diversity as gathered in this room today clearly has a sense of humor. A wave of appreciative sounds rippled through the assembly, chimes, clicks, bubbles, and even the rumbling equivalent of laughter from ancient Zoltar himself. As the formal proceedings concluded and the representatives began to disperse, Secretary Neelima found herself walking alongside Elder Lumara toward the chamber exit. You knew all along, didn't you? Neelima asked, her tendrils forming a pattern of respectful curiosity, not just about the Terrans, but about how they would change us. Lumara's ancient eyes gleamed with satisfaction. I suspected, after 12 millennia of observing species rise and fall, one develops a sense for potential. The Terrans possess something rare, the ability to face the unknown with both humility and humor.
And you believed we needed that perspective, Neelima realized.
The committee has many strengths, Lumara acknowledged, but adaptability has not been among them in recent millennia. We've become too comfortable with our processes, too certain of our understanding. The Terrans remind us that certainty is often an illusion, and that uncertainty need not be feared. They paused at the chamber threshold, watching as the three humans engaged with various committee members, building connections that would shape galactic policy for generations to come. "What happens now?" Nailima asked, her tendrils forming a pattern that expressed both hope and uncertainty. Lumara's scaled lips curved into a smile that somehow conveyed both ancient wisdom and youthful anticipation. "Now, my dear secretary, we begin asking better questions, together." As the stars continued their eternal dance beyond the observation dome, representatives from across the galaxy departed the Great Chamber, carrying with them not just diplomatic protocols and policy agendas, but something far more valuable, a renewed sense of wonder at the vast, absurd, magnificent universe they shared, and the countless questions still waiting to be asked. And somewhere, in whatever dimension great ideas reside before they're discovered, Douglas Adams might have been smiling, pleased that his cosmic joke had traveled farther than he could have imagined, bringing together beings separated by light years but united in their quest to make sense of the gloriously nonsensical universe they called home. The ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything remained unanswered, and that, perhaps, was the greatest answer of all. As our cosmic tale draws to a close, I hope you've enjoyed this journey through the stars and the unexpected diplomatic adventures of humanity among the galactic community. If this story of interstellar misunderstandings, philosophical humor, and the power of perspective resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video to let me know you'd enjoy more tales from this universe. Comment below with your favorite moment or what cosmic question you think the committee should tackle next. Share with friends who appreciate both science fiction and thoughtful humor. We all know someone who needs a good laugh about the absurdity of existence. Subscribe to ensure you never miss future stories and adventures across the stars. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll be the first to know when new cosmic tales arrive. After all, in the vastness of the internet, you wouldn't want to miss the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Until next time, remember what Professor Reyes taught us. Sometimes the most profound wisdom comes wrapped in a good joke. Stay curious, fellow travelers.